Or no, I don't know. Could
I
go
like the
either way.
snapshot guy, never saw it coming though.
That would be the best option.
That would be the option.
Let's go ahead and pray, and then we will get started. Dear Father in heaven, we thank you for the opportunity that we have to gather around the fellowship of your word. We pray, Lord, that as we study the life of your son Jesus, that you would use it to draw us closer to him. And we thank you, Lord, for his ministry of miracles. And we ask, Lord, that you would help us to understand these things this evening. We say this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
All right, moving on in the life of Christ. Today, we are going to be talking about the ministry Jesus had of miracles. And we're going to be talking about 4 things, hopefully. Talking about number 1.
Hold on.
Okay, well, we'll be going over all
trying
this
to get there.
stuff a couple of times here. So, I'm just telling you what I'm going to tell you.
Okay.
That's what you do. You tell people what you're going to tell them, then you tell them, then you
Even
tell them
as
what you
his
told them.
outline.
Okay. I'm waiting for
Okay,
the,
what is a miracle? What is a miracle? That's the first thing we're going to talk about. The second thing we're going to talk about is how the Gospels use miracles in their argumentation. The third thing we're going to talk about is the purpose of miracles. What's the purpose, particularly the miracles of Jesus? What was his purpose or purposes? And then we'll talk about the position on miracles today. That'll be if we have time. If we have time, we'll go through that, because that's kind of a big deal. Like that basically kind of talks about, like, do you still believe in miracles today? You still, if you do, is it just like a fluke? Is it just because God's kind of intervening? Is the apostolic age was at the end of miracles as a normative course, that kind of thing. So we'll talk a little bit about that if we have time to talk about it. All right. So the first thing is the definition of a miracle. What is a miracle? Now, the problem is that term miracle we've got 2 problems. Number 1, the New Testament doesn't have a word miracle. It's not there's no Greek word for miracle. I'll tell you what, well, there's 3 words, but I'll tell you what it is in a second. And the second thing is then we use the term miracle to mean a wide variety of things that doesn't really mean miracle in the technical sense. So, it's like you stopped before, hey, Jim, how you doing?
I had a call that was on, and they kept me half hour for something that should have took 10 minutes.
So, Jim, this is James.
I like that name.
I think I'll forget your name.
That's my legal name, but Mom only called me that when it was time for Dad to deal with me.
Yeah.
Wait till your dad gets home, James.
Mine was James Russell.
How you doing?
Don't I know you?
You
Yeah,
do. I used to go
What's
to
your first name?
Jason.
Jason.
And Jennifer.
Yes, my
Jason
wife.
used to go to.
Hi there.
Anyway.
I'm sorry
So,
I'm late.
no, it's quite all right.
Do you get this?
I do get those.
Oh.
I actually do get those.
Yeah.
You
Is
did.
that the newest one?
Yeah,
Yeah, I
that's,
haven't got that one yet.
keep it.
Well, thank you.
That's me. I'm sorry, I'll go back to what you
That's quite all right. Do you need a Bible? Would you like one?
do. Yeah, I do.
You're-
That's the one thing I forgot on my desk because of the rush.
Okay, there you go.
Thank you, thank you.
It's good to see you. Okay, so we are talking about miracles, and we're going to talk about 4 things about miracles real quickly. What is a miracle? How the Gospels use miracles, and what was the purpose of Jesus using miracles in particular, and then what's the deal today? Are there miracles today? Is that age over with, or does it continue on? And what are the ramifications of that? So we're going to particularly talk about this in the life of Jesus. And we were just talking about what is a miracle. We said the first problem that we have is really that the word miracle is not found in the New Testament as we understand that term miracle today. They use other words, and I'll tell you about those in just a second. But the other one is then we use that term miracle to mean something more than miracle, kind of. It's like we use it to mean like God's extraordinary providence sometimes, like we think about the miracle of childbirth or something like that. Well, that's not really technically a miracle. I mean, that's something that happens every.
Biological.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. It's awesome. It's cool. But it's not technically a miracle because it's one of those things that's going on in the course of everyday life. Also, providential things aren't necessarily miracles either. We'd say that God had a great providence, like when you meet somebody at the store and you're witnessing to them or something like that. It's like, oh, we might say something that was a miraculous event. What we mean by that is kind of an extraordinary providence of God that we didn't expect that day or something like that. But the term miracle in its technical definition really means that nature, the course of regular nature ceased and was reversed or intruded upon by God for a certain thing. So for example, somebody who is blind being able to see or something like that. Now there's a gray area here because sometimes we have natural healing abilities in the body, and there are times when you pray and God soups that up. Soups up the natural healing ability. So you have a cold, but instead of getting over it and you had like an event to go to, and maybe you had to preach the gospel or something like that, and instead of it taking 3 or 4 days, something happens and your body kind of naturally speeds the process up, and that was by the hand of God. That one, in my opinion, can kind of go either way. God is supernaturally kind of speeding up a normal process. But the technical term miracle means that the actual course of what it is that normally happens is interrupted. Okay, is interrupted and something else takes place. So a deaf person being able to hear, an axe head floating, that kind of thing. That wouldn't happen under any normal circumstances. Elijah. Yeah, they prayed, and the axe head floated up. Yes.
Could I share an actual real miracle with you that I know for sure works?
Oh.
I'll be real brief.
Okay.
2 years ago next month, I fell on our patio. And it wasn't the fall that caused this, but when I hit the concrete, because I understand I fell sort of backwards and split my skull open here. By the grace of the Lord, at about 10 p.m. at night, Susie was still awake, and she heard a bang out there. She thought maybe I'd knocked over a chair or something. But about 6-7 minutes later, I came into the house. I remember none of this. And I was holding my head here, and she says, "What are you doing?" I says, "I gotta go take care of this." I don't remember any of this either. She said the back of my shirt was filled with blood inside of my head and everything else, which she immediately called the neighbor, called 911 and everything. Anyway, for the next 6 or 7 weeks, I have no recollection of anything, nothing. But I guess I was awake and conscious. But they told her after the surgery that night, they had to do an emergency surgery that Sunday evening to get a blood clot out. And I'd lost a lot of blood too. But they told her for the next couple of weeks, "No, Mrs. Bonnie, we don't know if you'll ever be Jim again because we did all we could do, but we can't do this surgically, we can't do it pharmaceutically. Nerves have to reconnect." And they told her, to be honest with you, it almost never really happens.
Yeah.
And a lot of people, I didn't have the ability to pray then in. I mean, if I did, I don't remember it. But a lot of other people did.
Yeah.
But we don't change his mind. But I know it pleases him when we pray for other people that are in that situation. But when I went back after 6 months, I went back just to take some little German chocolates to the intensive care unit and to the old hospital on the 5th floor with neurologic rehab. And 4, 5, 6 different doctors that took care of me as I wasn't Jim yet. They're listening to me talk, they're seeing me standing there and everything else. And like one doctor says, he said, "If I hadn't seen you with your skull shaved and the staples holding it in there for where they took it apart," he says, "I'd never believe this would have happened to you." I said, "Why?" He says, "Your hair's all back here." He says, "I'm sure there's a scar underneath there," but he says, "Your face is normal, your eyes are normal, you're standing normal." He says, "I didn't know you before, but I can tell your brain's working normal." He said, "This is a miracle, Jim.
Yeah.
We've never seen this before. We can't explain why it happened." Well, and then he says, secondly, he says, "These nurses taking care of people that have head injuries, now they're gonna think, someday I might have another Jim Bonnie." Because they've never seen it before. They never see people come back because there's never enough good stuff to come back and be, whatever it is like that, but on the way home that day, I remember thinking Paul in the book of Acts, when he was talking to those Greeks, you know, he's running around the city, he saw all of what they worshipped, all these gods, he finally got up and got a chance to talk. Well, you worship the gods too, I worship God too, but he says, I worship the one that created us all, the one in whom we live and move and have our being, our consciousness, our personality. And I thought of that verse on the way home thinking, Lord, you gave me back my being, not the doctors. They took the blood clot out, but nerves were still frazzled, and it just, they told Susie it's probably never gonna happen. He'll never be Jim again like he was. I know it's a miracle, because doctors told me it's a miracle, and there's no other medical explanation for it. And so,
Praise God
they
for that.
do exist, and
Yes.
by his grace, he
Right.
granted me.
We will
I'm
talk
sorry to
about.
take that long with it, but I
No,
mean,
it's okay. But we will talk about miracles today and what's the paradigm in which they work. Okay, so the New Testament words in which the Bible uses, which are translated miracles and sometimes not, are signs, works, and you got it, wonders. Okay, those are the three words that are used. Now the problem with these, and this is why you got to take it into context, is because they also mean what they mean normally here. If I say there's a sign, I mean, am I talking about a miracle or am I talking about
A road sign.
a road sign? It can mean both of them, okay? And a works can mean the same thing. This is the word that Nicodemus used when he said to Jesus, he said, if it wasn't for the, we know you're a teacher come from God because of the works that you do. And obviously there he wasn't talking about feeding the poor and stuff like that. He was talking about the miracles, everything, and wonders as well. Okay, so these are all translated as miracles, and they mean miracles, but they can also mean signs, works, and wonders. But generally, I mean, it's not difficult to tell. So, for example, when Jesus heals the paralytic, and he calls that a sign, that means it's a miracle under that circumstance. So that's how the New Testament uses that term miracle. That's the translation of, depending upon the translation of the Bible you're using. Sometimes they'll try to be faithful to this, and sometimes they'll just translate it miracle if it means miracle. You know, because sometimes it means miracle. A sign means a miracle. Now, the word sign also means extraordinary providence of God as well. So you have to understand that it's always something extraordinary. It's never something normal. So, for example, when Saul was anointed king, it said that, you're going to go see these people, you're going to meet the prophets, and that's going to be a sign to you. Now, the prophets didn't materialize there like something, but it was extraordinary. It was out of the regular course of what normally would have happened. So that's what the term sign means too. It can include miracle, but it can also mean something kind of a little bit short of miracle as well. But it always means something. If somebody says this is a sign to you, it's not going to be like, oh, this is a sign to you. You're going to eat dinner tonight.
oh,
Well, yeah, of course. That's if I say, but this is going to be a sign to you that, on your way home, you're going to meet a friend you hadn't seen in 10 years. Now that wasn't a miracle in the sense of a miracle. It wasn't like your friend materialized there, but it was something extraordinary that happened. Now, again, the word sign can mean extraordinary thing. We're going to see that that's how it's used in the book of John, especially. All right. So how does the Gospels use miracles? And I want to focus on two Gospels in particular, and that is Matthew and John. Now, Mark and Luke are generally attempting to chronologize the life of Christ, and they put the miracles more in the appropriate places as they happened, as they unfolded. Okay, and in doing that, they still have meaning to those miracles. They still, it still means something in each time they do it. However, Matthew and John go out of their way to use miracles kind of differently as part of their overall argument. As a matter of fact,
To validate his ministry.
that's, yes, but it is to validate his ministry, but every miracle validates his ministry. these are used in a particular way in Matthew, and they're not in chronological order. Okay, so Mark and Luke are kind of like Jesus does this and there's a miracle, and then he goes over here and there's a miracle. It's trying to explain the life of Christ and put the miracles in the appropriate places. John and Matthew don't do that. John and Matthew have a certain order in which they do miracles. And in John records 7, and he calls them signs. 7 signs that Jesus does prior to the resurrection. Okay? And I'll call them out, but we're gonna look at a couple of these, obviously, after we get through a lot of this stuff. We'll look at these miracles, but we're gonna get through some of this preliminary stuff about miracles first. So, number 1, the first sign is in John chapter 2, verses 1 through 11, and that's Jesus changing the water into wine. So there are 7 signs that he does leading up to his resurrection, his death and resurrection.
Chapter 2,
1 through 11?
1 through 11. John chapter 2, 1 through 11. The second sign he does is he does the healing of the royal official's son. In chapter 4, verses 46 through 49, that's called the second sign that he did. And John uses that particular term, sign. In the third one is the healing of the paralytic at Bethsaida. In chapter 5, verses 1 through 15. That's the third sign. The fourth sign is that Jesus feeds the 5,000 in chapter 6, verses 5 through 19. The fifth sign is Jesus walks on water, chapter 6, verses 16 through 24. The healing of the blind man in chapter 9, verses 1 through 7. And then and the seventh sign is the raising of Lazarus, chapter 11, verses 1 through 14. And those are the 7 signs that Jesus does in the book of John. So John is kind of crescendoing up to his resurrection, which is his final sign, which he does to validate his ministry. But he does these signs and he builds up to this resurrection of Lazarus in a prelude to the resurrection of himself. Now, Matthew also uses miracles kind of in a unique way as well. What he does is he talks about the ministry of Christ, the teaching ministry of Christ, and then uses miracles to prove the teaching ministry of Christ. So, for example, and here's a big word, inclusio. You know what inclusio is? That's where it's like ends of a bookshelf. So if you have a bookshelf, then you have all your books here, and then at the other end you have another bookshelf, right?
well, the bookends.
Yeah, bookends. Oh, sorry, did I say bookshelf? I meant bookends.
Holds it together.
It holds it together. So literary speaking, when somebody does this, they're bracketing the information, basically. They're saying, and you can tell this because what they do is they'll use the same words at the beginning that they use at the end.
And what was the word, inclusio?
Inclusio. So look at, and now here we're going to get to some Bible stuff here. Look at Matthew chapter 4 and verse 23. Somebody wants to read that? Go ahead.
When he went throughout all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every disease and every affliction among the people.
Okay. Now, turn to Matthew chapter 9 and verse 35.
Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the good news of the kingdom and healing every disease and sickness.
Okay, so there we have a really good inclusio from chapter 4, 23 to 9, 35. And what's in between chapter 4 and chapter 9? Well, we have the Sermon on the Mount, which we already discussed. This is what Jesus This was Jesus' ministry of his kingdom, how he wanted people under the new covenant to live. But then after the Sermon on the Mount, what happens? You have a big block of miracles, a big, huge block of miracles after that. In other words, what he's saying is, here's Jesus' teaching, and in order to validate his teaching, now I'm going to tell you about the miracles. And they're actually some of the most comprehensive miracles, or the most unique miracles in Jesus' ministry, and they all demonstrate something about Jesus. So Jesus heals the leopard. Jesus heals the centurion's son. Jesus heals many. Jesus calms the storm. Jesus casts out demons. Jesus heals paralytic. Okay, so all these things happen here, and then we don't get another miracle, because then after 9:35, what you have is another big teaching block, and then we don't get another miracle until chapter 11 or 12, somewhere around there. I have to look at that. So how does Matthew use the miracles of Christ? It's to validate his teaching ministry. Remember, what's the overall theme of Matthew? What is Matthew most concerned with?
What Jesus said.
The words of Jesus. As a matter of fact, if you have a red letter edition of a Bible, you will find that there are more red letters in Matthew than there are in Mark, Luke, and John combined. Because Matthew is a Jew writing to Jews, and he wants to know what Jesus taught. That's the big deal. What did Jesus teach? And so you find your most explained sermons, not all of them, of course, there are a few exceptions outside this, but for the most part, boy, you got a lot of sermons in the book of Matthew, a lot of sermons in the book of Matthew. And so what you have is you have sermon, miracles, sermon, miracles, sermon, miracles. That seems to be the theme of Matthew, is to use miracles to validate his teaching ministry. Okay. One last thing before we get into some of these miracles. What is the purpose of a miracle then? Now we know the gospel's purpose of it, but why did Jesus do miracles?
To show God's power.
Okay, all right. That's a good one.
He was the Son of God.
Yeah,
Okay.
to prove his.
What'd you say? Show God's power? All right. Okay. Second one was, what did you say, Jim?
To prove he was the Messiah, the Son of the Lord Most High.
Okay, so let me ask you this then. Okay, does the miracles that Elijah did prove that he was the Son of God?
No.
Okay, so
He didn't say he was. Jesus
Ah,
said
there we go. Okay. All right. So I want to get to the overall thing, and that is it proves his message.
Yes.
So whatever that message is, and under Elijah, under Moses, under whatever it is, it proves the message. Because a lot of times people will say something like, well, the teaching ministry of Jesus demonstrates that he was the Son of God. Or not the teaching ministry, the miracle ministry of Jesus demonstrates that he was the Son of God. And I say, well, does the teaching ministry of Moses prove that he was the Son of God? No. Or prove that he was deity? No. What it does is it proves whatever the message is, the message of that person. However, there is something that we're going to kind of start with here as we look at the miracles, because there is an aspect of the miracles of Christ that is often overlooked, and it is to,
Let me guess.
go ahead.
Build faith.
No, well, I think that's part
Because
of
at
it.
the end of John, he says that, he did these things that you may believe.
Right, yes, for sure. I wouldn't disagree with that. That would not exactly, but one of the aspects that I think people often miss is that it reveals the heart. And much like the miracles of Moses in the 10 plagues revealed the heart, is the instrument God used to reveal the heart of Pharaoh. So many times in the New Testament, Jesus uses miracles to reveal the heart of his adversaries, to show them, to demonstrate them. All he's got to do is do something good. That's all he's got to do is do something. That's the depravity of man here. He does something. Man is so evil that in the light of something good that God does, particularly Jesus,
They want to kill him.
they want to kill him. They want to kill him, and he goes out of his way. He goes out of his way almost to do this, because there are a few times where he specifically does miracles on the Sabbath. So I'm going to give you a list of 3 of them here, and there are more. And then go ahead, Jim, if you want to. In John chapter 5 and verse 9, when he heals the paralytic, that was on the Sabbath. When he heals the blind person in John 9:14, that was on the Sabbath.
What was the first one, John 5?
John 5:9, yeah. And in Mark 3:2, when he heals the guy with the withered hand, that was on the Sabbath. And what's interesting is the one in John, which we're going to look at here in just a minute, it also reveals that person's heart as well, because Jesus could have healed him the next day. I mean, he was he wasn't like the pool was closed down, the rest of the week. Jesus could have come the next day and healed him. Jesus could have healed this blind man the next day. It's almost like he could have said, oh, well, I don't want to offend people. I'll come and heal him I'll do something good the day after. It's almost like he said, look, I'm going to do this on the Sabbath, whether you like it or not. So let's have a look at some of these miracles then too. And we're going to look at a few of these over the course of the life of Jesus. So the first one I want to look at is in John chapter 5 and verse 9. And we'll go ahead and get into some biblical exegesis at this point. Did you want to say something, Jim?
Yeah, I just read a verse at home in a daily devotional, and it was near the end for Jesus, and the Pharisees were really after him. Come on, who are you? Who do you know? And Jesus pretty much told them, I'm the Messiah, I'm the Son of God. And he says, but you've seen all the miracles, you've seen, me showing you that I'm the Son of God with the power of God, but you don't believe because you're not my sheep hear my voice and know me. Even in John chapter 2, at the end of that chapter, there's many that follow him. He just ignored them because he knew
what was in the hearts of all men.
Yeah.
So he didn't commit himself to them.
But those who see the miracles and believe, see, that's where he said,
right.
They're my sheep. They get
so miracles don't in and of themselves convert anybody. Okay, I often hear atheists today say something like, well, I would believe in God if, this one guy in a debate said if this pulp had floated 5 feet up in the air and went down again. Greg Bahnsen said to them, you wouldn't believe in God if that happened. You would just think that it was a trick, or you would think that maybe in the future science would solve how that happened. You would readjust the evidence in light of your worldview. That's what people do. They readjust evidence in light of their worldview. Now, with Jesus, they didn't deny his miracles because they couldn't deny his miracles. What they did was they attributed him to either Satan, or much later, they said things like, well, he learned dark arts down when he was in Egypt, and when he came out of Egypt, he learned these kind of things. But they didn't deny the miracles, but they weren't willing to accept him because they didn't deny the miracles because they weren't atheists, okay? That wasn't their worldview, but their worldview was definitely not a Christian worldview, so they reinterpreted the miracles in light of their worldview. That's what people do with facts. That's why, and we'll get into this in our next course, this is why I don't engage in factual apologetics. I love facts. I love using facts to embarrass the unbeliever, but quite honestly, if you give facts to an unbeliever, all he does is he reinterprets those facts to fit his worldview. You can talk about evidences for the resurrection all the livelong day. All he's going to do is reinterpret those facts to fit his model. He'll say something like, even if you prove the resurrection, they end up saying something like, well, yeah, maybe he did rise from the dead, but one day science will find a way to figure out how that happened, and we don't need God for that.
He wasn't really dead.
They say that too. Yeah, they say all kinds of things. You see, that's it. Okay, so John chapter 5, let's start in verse 1. And we're going to compare this guy who gets healed to the guy who is born blind who gets healed. And we're going to see some astounding things that Jesus says about the importance of miracles as well. It says, after this there was a feast day of the Jews, and Jesus went up to the Jerusalem. Now it's very interesting here because they don't tell you what feast day this is. And it says that Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now he's in Galilee at the time. And normally we think of Galilee as north and Jerusalem as south. However, it is in elevation up. So when it says they went up, they're traveling south, but they're inclining as they're going south. So that's why it says he goes up. Now, it doesn't say which feast this is, but there were 3 feasts every year that they were commanded to go to. Does anybody know?
Booths, Pentecost, and Passover.
Yep, those are the 3.
What was the first one?
Booths,
What?
Booths, like
Oh.
booth.
Pentecost, and
Pentecost and
Passover.
Passover.
Those are the 3 that every male was commanded to go to. And normally, most scholars think that this was the Feast of Booths here. This is where they celebrated roaming in the wilderness. Now there was in Jerusalem, by the sheep gate, a pool in Aramaic called Bethsaida, which means, by the way, house of mercy, just so you know. House of mercy, which has 5 roofed colonnades. Now this used to be one of those things that was sore for biblical archaeology until they found it. You get this all the time. People say, oh, well, we can't find where this place is and all this stuff. But then when they were digging around by the Church of St. Anne in Jerusalem, they actually found this place. And it had 5 colonnades, just like it said. So what that means is you can imagine a pool. And they had pools in those days for the same reason we have pools today, to cool off. They would do like bathing there kind of thing. Now they were Jews. They didn't do any nude type of bathing or anything like that, like the Greeks kind of did. But they did, they'd go swimming. I mean, it was like a swimming kind of thing that they did. Now, the reason why it had 5, and this is kind of interesting because they found this, is because the pool was separated by a wall. So it was really kind of like 2 pools, like today we have like the shallow end and that kind of thing, like the kids pool and the adult pool. I don't know if it was anything like that, but it says it had 5 colonnades, which is like a tarp kind of thing over the head, so that you would be able to stay out of the sun.
Like a
So,
sunscreen.
yeah, so you can picture, one here, one here, one here, and one here, but there was a 5th one, and the 5th one was in the middle. So they actually found the one that had 5 in it. So there's pool on each side. That way it was able to have 5 places to rest from the sun, out from the sun. And it says that it was by the sheep gate, a pool in Aramaic called Bethsaida, which had 5 roofed colonnades. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. That is a long time to be an invalid. He was there for 38 years. When Jesus saw him laying there, he knew that he had already been there a long time. He said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" Now, some people think that's a little bit of an odd question for Jesus to ask. Do you want to be healed? It's like, duh, of course. But I actually think there's some insight here. First of all, it's better than, how's your day going? Hey, how are you? How's your day going? It's like, well, I'm an invalid living in the 1st century. There's no welfare, so that's how my day is going. But the other thing is I think there is a sense in which he would really want to know, do you want to be healed? Because rich people were rich and poor people were very poor. I mean, you could work all day in the field for just meager amounts of money. And you know how much panhandlers can get. You know how much they can get. And it wasn't a whole lot different in this day. People who panhandled could make a living. They could make some money. So Jesus asks him,
while
"Are you?"
laying by the pool.
Yeah, while laying by the pool. Jesus asks him, "Do you want to be healed?" Now the other thing is I think this reveals something about the heart of the individual. It's like when God asks Adam, "Where are you?" It's not like he doesn't know where Adam is. When he asks Adam, it gives this person a chance to respond. It says, "The sick man answered, 'Sir, I have no one to put me in the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I am going, another steps down before me. And Jesus said to him, get up, take your bed, and walk. And at once the man was healed. He took up his bed and he walked. Now, taking your bed and walking was a violation of the Sabbath, by the way. Just so you know, that was a violation of the Sabbath. You weren't supposed to do all kinds of stuff. Now, the Sabbath was supposed to be a rest day. God put that in place, and as Jesus said, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And it's supposed to be a nice vacation day from your work. God commanded it. That's one aspect of it. There are other aspects of it, but that was one aspect of it. But these people made so many rules about the Sabbath that it became a matter of worry. It's just like, am I violating the Sabbath? Am I violating the Sabbath? Am I walking too far on the Sabbath? Am I doing this? And they had all kinds of loopholes as well. These people had all kinds of loopholes for this. For example, here's one loophole. You're not supposed to travel a certain distance on the Sabbath. Now they did. You know how they got around that? Is they would leave a toothbrush or a comb at a certain point. Because if you had an item from home at a certain place, you could consider that spot your home for a second.
Gosh.
So then all you had to do is walk to that rock that had your toothbrush, which was a Sabbath day journey, have a seat for a second, and then walk again until you're, to wherever you wanted to go. So they had all these kind of loopholes. There's one loophole where it said when you're sewing, and you had to sew, you couldn't, before on Friday night, before the sun went down, you had to sew your thread in your needle into the garment, in which you couldn't leave it hanging. You couldn't leave it hanging. And the reason you couldn't leave it hanging is because you might notice a tear in your clothes. And if it's hanging there, then you might just accidentally not think about it, and you might take it and start sewing and not realizing that the sun had gone down. And therefore you're working on the Sabbath by sewing a hole in your clothes. You weren't allowed to look in a mirror on the Sabbath either. Okay?
Wow.
Because if you looked in the mirror on a Sabbath, you might notice that one of your hairs is gray and you might be tempted to pull it out. These are all things that they wrote down in the Talmud. Yeah, you might be tempted to pull it out. And if you pulled it out, that would constitute work on the Sabbath. You weren't allowed to bear a load on the Sabbath, which was what this bed was a load that he was bearing on the Sabbath. Now, do you know how much a load was? 2 dried figs. If it weighed more than, if it wasn't part of your clothing, now they did say you could wear your clothes and all that stuff because that weighs more than 2 dried figs. But if it was more than 2 dried figs, then it was considered a load, and you weren't allowed to carry it on the Sabbath. So that's why when they would go to the Sabbath day, they'd only leave a toothbrush or something like that, not something heavy or something, so they could pick up their toothbrush because that didn't weigh a lot.
Pretty prohibitive.
Yes, very prohibitive, and that's just even scratching the surface. There's so many of these that we're actually going to get into another one in a minute here, or hopefully. Before we're done talking about miracles, whether it's this week or next week, we'll talk about a few more of these. And look at what it says here. So at once, in verse 9, at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and walked. Now that day was the Sabbath. So the Jews said to the man who had been healed, it is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to take up your bed. He says, you're carrying more than you're supposed to be carrying. But he answered to them, the man who healed me, that man said to me, take up your bed and walk. So he said, look, I'm just doing what the guy who healed me said. And they asked him, who is the man who said to you, take up your bed and walk? Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn. As there was, Jesus didn't tell him his name. Jesus didn't, and now he's withdrawn. Now there was a crowd in that place. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, see, you are well. So then he finds him and he says, see, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you. Okay. Now I have to ask you a question. Physically speaking, this guy is living in the 1st century. Okay? No Medicare, Medicaid, no Salvation Army. He is a paralytic. Now, we're not sure to the extent that he couldn't move, but it was pretty bad because he couldn't make it into the pool. So he could have been, up to paraplegic or something like that. There was something bad happening here. Physically speaking, what could be worse than that?
Quad.
Huh?
Be a quad.
Quad. Do you think that's what Jesus was really threatening with?
No.
I think Jesus is saying,
No.
now don't sin anymore,
Or I'm gonna make you a quad.
or I'm going to make you a quadriplegic instead of a paraplegic. That would be worse, but we don't know what it was exactly. No. This is something we must understand about miracles, and that is that Jesus, what he's being threatened here with is hell, because this guy's not converted.
Something worse to me would be wrath.
Yes. Jesus is more concerned about your spiritual welfare than he is about your physical welfare. And that's just the way it is. Now, it's not that Jesus is not concerned about your physical welfare, but you understand that we don't want for this life. That is for the next life. That's for the new heaven and the new earth. Jesus is more concerned about maybe, the hate or the anger or the lust or whatever it is in your heart than he is concerned about your physical welfare. Now, one exemplar of this is Johnny Erickson Tata. Now I tell you what, I normally don't believe in women preachers, but if she ever came, I would put her into the pulpit so fast it'd straighten your hair. But she has had many people say, can I pray for you? Can I, you get the charismatics and stuff for healing. And she always says something like, yes, could you? Because I have a really bitter heart towards my husband. And I'm just carrying this grudge around. I am, she exemplifies this aspect here. Christ is more concerned about your spiritual welfare than he is about your physical welfare, because he knows that there is a day in which your physical welfare will be taken care of. It's not that he's not concerned about that. Good night. That's part of the reason he died. Part of the reason he died and rose again from the dead was to create a new heaven and a new earth in which all physical ailments will be done away with. But right now, when he reversed the curse, just like the curse, like if you back with Adam and Eve, and you ate the apple and you saw that happen, the next moment it wouldn't look like a whole lot different. You wouldn't be looking around seeing great catastrophes. It kind of like a cancer grew, sin like a cancer grew. And what God does now that he comes and he switches it, when he switches and he reverses the curse, he's more concerned about spiritual growth in this age than he is about physical growth in this age. He considers, notice this here, see that nothing worse happens to you. He considers your bad heart to be more important to change than even a physical ailment that left you at the mercy of others. That's how he considers, that's how important the spiritual aspect of it is. I don't think it could get a lot worse for this guy. He says, sin no more, that's something worse. What are you going to be able to live less than I already was? No, the worst is the hell that this person is going to endure. So we know this guy's not saved because what does he do? He rats Jesus out.
Yep.
He rats him out. He says, the man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who healed him, and this was why the Jews persecuted Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But he answered them, my Father is working until now, and I am working. So he did these things on the Sabbath, and he basically says, what you see God doing, I'm doing. Okay? There's a big debate about whether or not the Sabbath is for today. And one of the arguments I think that is just preposterous that Sabbath keepers use is the idea that, well, we rest because God rested. And I say, yeah, but God rested once. Jesus here says, I'm working until now. God has not taken a break every 7 days since the creation of the world. So if you want to do it because God did it, then you get one Sabbath. That's it. You choose your day off, and the rest of the time you have to work. His Father is working till now. Yes, Jim.
Speaking of the Sabbath, I'm thankful that the Lord doesn't ban people for the Sabbath, because this was a Sunday night, and if that doctor would have been one of these Pharisees, I would have died that night, because he told Susie before the surgery, I got less than a half hour, I'm gonna lose him. And it was still Sunday, it was about 11 p.m., I guess, when all this, the surgery.
Yeah.
It was the Sabbath according to what we understand nowadays. What Saturday's the official Sabbath, I don't know, but.
Presbyterians generally view Sunday as the Sabbath now. They say it's still a Sabbath, but it's transferred over. And what Jesus did was cleared up misconceptions about what the Sabbath did, what the Sabbath meant. And so a Presbyterian, even though he looked at Sunday as the Sabbath, would still say it's okay, given in the light of what Jesus did, to work on you, because you can do, and they have 3 exceptions of this: works of necessity, works of ministry, and works of healing. So you can do those 3 works of charity. You can do those 3 things in the Presbyterian
Church
church.
sees this right here, healing.
Yeah, so he would say, like, well, given the example of what Jesus did, then of course we can do, if it's something you have to do, then of course you have to do it. If it's something for worship, of course you have to, if you have to clean the church, then of course you have to do that. And if it's something of a charitable nature, then you can go ahead and do that as well.
When Jesus told him, like you said, he's more concerned about his heart than his physical, the affliction he had.
Yes.
And I think the Lord, probably right now where it is too, when the Lord was telling him one time, don't fear him who can kill a body. Fear him who can kill a body and throw the soul in hell forever.
Yeah, right.
So he talked about hell 4 times more than he did heaven. Jesus did when he was here. I heard a preacher say one time, why? He says, because he created it. He knows how bad it is.
Yeah, for sure. I would agree with that for sure. Okay, one more, and then we'll get to John 9. One more short one. Turn to Mark chapter 2. We're going to look at the one with the guy with the withered hand, because Jesus is doing these things on the Sabbath, and so they kind of want to see if he's going to. So they set him up here. They set him up with a plant here on the Sabbath. No, sorry, Mark 3:2. I'm sorry. Mark chapter 3 and verse 2. Again, he entered the synagogue, and a man with the withered hand, and there was a man with a withered hand, and they watched Jesus. So they knew that this was going to happen here. So they put this guy here with the withered hand, and they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath. So he has this reputation of healing people on the Sabbath. Now, why are they now doing this? What does it say? So that they might accuse him. So they want to officially accuse him of doing this. This would be an official accusation of him of breaking the law, which he didn't care about. And he said to the man with the withered hand, come here. And he said to them, he's looking at them, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save a life or to kill? But they were silent. And he looked about around at them with anger, and grieved at their hardness of heart. And he said to them, stretch out your hand. He stretched out his hand, and it was restored. And the Pharisees went out immediately, held counsel with the Herodians against him, how they would destroy him. Now, the impact of that, this is like saying the KKK and the National Black Caucus got together to do something. Say, these are the Pharisees who hated the Herodians, who hated Herod, and the Herodians who were faithful to Herod. They both got together to try to destroy him. See, the world is against Jesus. The world, they're still. They might not like each other, but they will be on the same team if it's to
The liberals and the Muslims working together.
Yep.
Yeah.
That is a perfect analogy of or not analogy, example of what's going on today, which is analogous to this. Yeah, the liberals and the Muslims working together to destroy Christianity. It hasn't changed at all. By the way, there's nothing wrong with being angry, right?
I see that.
If you're angry, Jesus
Stop
was angry.
singing your anger.
Remember
Yes.
in the temple and started throwing stuff around, he wasn't too happy that day either.
He wasn't. Okay, and the last miracle we'll look at tonight is back in John chapter 9, comparing the first man to this man. And we'll just start in verse 1. As he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Now, this is one of the verses that LDS people try to use to prove the pre-incarnate life. Pre-incarnate life.
Pre-existence.
Yeah, they used to call it pre-existence. They don't call it pre-existence anymore.
No?
They call it
No?
pre-incarnate life.
Yes, they
pre-incarnate.
call it the pre-mortal life.
Pre-mortal life.
They call it the
Pre-mortal.
pre-mortal life because pre-existence is kind of an oxymoron. How can you exist before you exist? Yeah, so they stopped calling it that because it's kind of funny. So they started calling it now. If you look at their literature today, they call it the pre-mortal life. And because they do this is because they say this happened. How did he sin if he wasn't born yet? Did this man sin that he was born blind? How could he sin if he was, when would he have sinned if he was born blind, right? Well, again, the Talmuds and the Targums help us out on this kind of stuff. They believe that you could actually sin in the womb. The Jews believe that you could sin in the womb.
Oh my word.
And so, David said, I was conceived in iniquity, so that they believe that they could commit sin in the womb. Now, another thing to tie this back to what he said earlier about the situation with sin and illness. Sometimes sin and illness are connected. Sometimes they're not. But let me say this, in one sense, all sin and illness are connected. Because if Adam hadn't sinned,
Right.
and if you hadn't sinned, you would never be sick a day in your life. Okay? It is a result, sickness, this corruption in this world is a result of sin altogether. But we can't carry this into that idea into the friends of Job, who kind of come to him and say, well, do you want anything to confess? There's so much bad stuff happening to you that we are not allowed to make that judgment call. We are not allowed to make that judgment call. But the idea here is that, that this person's born blind because either he sinned or a result of his parents' sin. But Jesus answered and says it's not either of these things. Excuse me, is there a Kleenex over there or something?
In on my desk in the other room, there's a box.
I should say now, the in on my, not my desk.
Thanks for sharing.
All right. Sorry about that. I couldn't help it. My nose is running here. And I said it was not this man's sin or his parents, but the work of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no work can be done. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Having said these things, he spit on the ground and made mud with his saliva. Then he anointed the man's eyes with mud and said to him, go wash in the pool of Salmon, which means sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. Now, a lot of ink has been spilled over why spit, why make the mud, why do all this stuff. I mean, Jesus can just do that. Now, there have been a couple of answers given. So let me just give you one answer that we can all agree with, and that is that this this man had to go do something in order to see. You know, he had to go and obey the word of God. That's faith in God right there.
Right.
Okay?
It shows a
his-
trust.
it
It
in
shows a
faith.
trust. It
Yeah.
shows a trust in his action that he actually went and did this. However, there's been two reasons why he spit in the ground. So I'll give you both of them, and they both come out of the Talmud. The first one is that the Talmud says a lot about the firstborn son, that he's special, that he's sacred. And it even says that he's so sacred that his saliva is sacred. And there is a big question, especially in the book of John, as to whose son is, who is Jesus his father. That's a big deal. They even backhandedly accuse him earlier in chapter 8 when they say, we're not born of fornication. You know, there is a big question mark over Jesus. So Jesus could be saying here, my saliva validates my legitimacy. Okay, that's one option.
Interesting.
It is interesting, and it could very well be both of these things. Okay, the second thing is guess what else you weren't supposed to do on the Sabbath? Spit. And why weren't you supposed to spit?
It's work.
Because, well, if you spit, yes, it's work, but what makes it work? If you spit, you might have, because a lot of people were farmers, and if you spit on the ground on the Sabbath, you might actually have some seed in your pocket or whatever.
Oh
and
gosh,
you
you
might
just
accidentally
germinated a
you
seed.
might accidentally.
You are kidding me.
Nope. You might accidentally germinate a seed, and
I
then that
like
would
the other one
constitute
better.
work on the Sabbath. Now, it does make a big deal about that it was the Sabbath, because you look at verse 14.
Right.
It says, "Now it was the Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes." And he didn't just make mud; he made it with his spit. So it could be both too. You know, you don't have to boil it down to one or the other. But those are the two reasons traditionally why it's given. Number one, it's not good to spit on the Sabbath because it constitutes work. And then the second thing is that it says in the Talmud that the firstborn is holy and set apart. Even his saliva is set apart. And Jesus, with the big question mark over whether or not he was, whose father he was, he demonstrated his legitimacy by spitting and making this thing that actually opened the eyes of the blind. Okay. All right, he spit on the ground, and then the guy went and washed. So he went and washed, and he came back seeing. The neighbors and those who had seen him before the beggar were saying, "Is this not the man who used to sit and beg?" And some said, "It is he." Others said, "No, but it looks like him." So he kept saying, "I'm the man." He kept saying this, "I'm the man, I'm the man." So he said to him, "Then how were your eyes open?" He answered, "A man called Jesus made mud and anointed my eyes and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' So I went and washed, and I received my sight." And they said to him, "Where is he?" He said, "I don't know." They brought him to the Pharisees, the man who had been formerly blind. Now it was the Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened the eyes. So the Pharisees asked again him how he had received his sight. And he said to them, "He put mud on my eyes, and I washed, and I see. Now the Pharisees said, 'This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath.' But others said, 'How can a man who is a sinner do such signs?' And there was a division among them. So they said again to the blind man, 'What do you say about him, since he has opened your eyes?' And he said, 'He is a prophet.' And the Jews did not believe that he had been blind. And this kind of goes back and forth and back and forth. So finally he finds them. In verse 35, it says, Jesus heard that they cast him out. So he doesn't rat on. He actually stands so firm that he gets cast out of the synagogue. And having found him, he said, 'Do you believe in the Son of Man?' He answered, 'And who is he, sir, that I may believe in him?' Jesus said to him, 'You have seen him, and he is the one speaking to you.' And he said, 'Lord, I believe,' and he worshipped him. And Jesus said, 'For judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind. Okay? So one of the reasons for Jesus' ministry in miracles was to indict people who wouldn't believe no matter what. They wouldn't believe no matter what. So they could never have an excuse. So they could never have an excuse. Now, I am not premillennial in my eschatology. I'm not historic premillennial. Although I do find some of their reasonings and some of their things valid. I'm amillennial. I've talked about this before. I would be considered kind of a weak amillennial. But in historic premillennialism, one of the reasons they believe Jesus comes back and lives on this earth during this millennial period is the final indictment on the world. To say that you can even have Jesus here in physical form, post-resurrection, ruling and reigning, and people still won't believe. People will still try to kill him. It's kind of foolish, but just think of Lazarus being raised from the dead.
Yeah.
What they want to do to Lazarus. He just got raised from the dead. Now, he didn't get raised to immortality, but they wanted to kill him again. A guy who just got raised from the dead, they wanted to kill him again. It's like, well, Jesus just raised him from the dead the first time. This is part of the foolishness of unbelief. And whether or not premillennialism, I don't believe in dispensational premillennialism at all, but whether or not historic premillennialism is true, that is a valid point. That even if it was true, even if Jesus was here and he was ruling and reigning on the earth physically in a resurrected body, with all of us in physical resurrected bodies, the unbeliever's heart is so unregenerate that it would not make a difference in their life. And we can see that here. Yes,
I think
last.
the 2 verses from Romans, the heart of man is wicked and deceitful above all things. There's none who seeks after God, no, not one, unless he sends his spirit and regenerates us. And like as he did with these people that he did the miracles for, and they believed.
Yes.
Because
right.
they were infiltrated by the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Otherwise, they're wicked and deceitful above all things.
Yeah. Well, and that's part of what we were talking about in our study in Hosea on Sundays as well, is we're looking at God saying, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, I'm pouring out, you saying, I'm pouring out even my love. And a lot of people, a lot of non-Calvinists have jumped on that verse. And I'm saying, no, that proves Calvinism. That proves that God can do everything outwardly, everything outwardly to a person, to a nation, and it won't make a bit of a difference. He can even pour out his love on a person outwardly, and it won't make a difference until regeneration happens, which is a sovereign work of God. Same here in the life of Jesus. All right. Any questions about this?
It was good. Thank you.
Yes.
I had an actual physical miracle many years ago.
Okay.
An actual physical healing. I was working, of all places, at the haunted house up in Salt Lake, helping them build their sets and everything. And I had taken a 28-foot extension ladder and put it up on the main truss of the building, and we were taking black plastic and stapling it to the ceiling and then down to the walls to help, block out each room. And I set the ladder up, grabbed the plastic, started climbing the ladder, and my helper, Dave, was coming over to hold the ladder. And I reached up like this and got one staple in, went like this to get the second staple in, and then the ladder went before Dave got there. I'm 28 feet in the air.
Oh.
Wow. What happened?
I hit the floor.
Okay.
And hit the floor really hard.
So I'm
The
waiting for
ladder-
the miracle here. 'Cause
Okay,
that's not
the
it.
ladder went out.
You sure that's
That's not the miracle. It'll come. The ladder went out. I rode the ladder down until it hit the top of the walls were 4x8 sheets of plywood framed out. It hit the ladder with me on it, hit the wall. I bounced off, landed on my left hip, and thankfully my martial arts kicked in. I landed, I tucked. It just happened so fast. I hit the ground. I literally bounced up on my feet. Took 3 steps and collapsed. Dave come running over. You okay? Nope. You need to get me to the hospital. So he loads me up. I get a hold of her. When she shows up at the hospital, I'm still in the waiting area, and I'm like the color of your coffee cup.
Oh my.
I'm gray.
You're gray.
I am. And she walks in and just starts ripping on him, says, you need to get him back there now. So they get me back there, and in my left arm, the ulnar bone was pushed out about this far.
Okay. I can see the scar there.
Okay, well, that's a different scar.
Okay.
That's totally different.
Okay.
Different ordeal. But anyway, we get in there, they check me out. The ER doctor comes in and he starts checking me out, and I told him, he said, hey, my arm, and he starts feeling it. And he goes, that's a really nasty break. He says, we'll make sure we, numb you up before we set it and everything. And he says, he's pushing on, he could feel the end of the bone.
Yeah.
And he said, we'll get radiologists in here in a little bit to get x-rays of everything and make sure you're okay. My hip and my arm, that was the only thing that really I had pain on. And I can't remember the guy's name, but there was a pastor, Father Uri.
I knew him.
Okay, that's right.
Pretty well, I went and found him.
Anyway, she brought him in, and he came in and started praying over me and her, and I don't know who else was there besides just the three of us. Okay. But as we're praying,
Then the radiologist came in
the as we're praying, the radiologist comes in, and as he's praying and she's praying, I get this just intense burning sensation in my left arm. I mean, it about put me about passed out. It hurt so bad. It's just this burn. We finished up. Radiologist took me back in a wheelchair, x-rayed my arm, x-rayed my hip, wheeled me back in, got back up on the ER gurney, and I'm sitting there, and about 5-10 minutes later, the ER doc comes in, and he's got the films in his hand, and he's shaking his head, and then I don't get it. I don't get it. And he sticks the films up in the x-ray reader, and he goes, your arm's not broken, but it was broken because I could feel the bone.
Mhm.
It's not broken.
Wow. Praise God.
And you could move it? and it
Oh,
worked?
yeah. It was still all bulged out, but it was all soft and gushy.
He ended up with a hematoma, but
Oh.
before he was borderline green stick.
Yeah, borderline green stick
It was about
poking
ready
out.
to come through the skin.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Wow.
Praise God.
Yeah.
The miracles
Yeah.
happen today. Amen.
Yeah, that was just,
Miracles happen today.
okay,
I
I
had
got one more for you.
friend, I'll tell you one too. I had a friend, they used to live here a long time ago, but she was married to a guy who was not a good guy, and she left her car running and the kid in the car, and the guy was really a bad guy, and the kid so she was afraid that if something happened to the car, then it was only like in the parking lot or whatever, so it wasn't like the kid was going to get hurt or anything. It would just hit the car or whatever. But she was more afraid of her husband being upset that this happened, which she shouldn't have done in the first place. Obviously,
Right.
leave the kid in the car with the car running. But it was that was the '80s. It wasn't like we had all this safety stuff going on. And so she threw herself in front of the car, just to try to get between her and the car in the building, and it crushed her hips, just totally messed her hips up. And when she was in the hospital, they prayed for her, and her hips went back. Nothing wrong with your hips. Nothing wrong with your hips.
Oh,
My brother was saved by an actual miracle of his youngest daughter.
Oh,
She was born with a bone defect where the growth plates don't grow properly.
Oh.
And they were going to go in and do surgery on her hips, and they did all these things, and they had been working with her for quite a few years. And they went in and did the x-rays, did the MRIs, did all the things that they needed to do 2 weeks prior to surgery. And 3 days before surgery, they went in for the last, pre-surgery visit. And they did another set of x-rays just to make sure. And he did the same thing, walking in, shaking his head. He had the old films in this hand and the new films in this hand.
The church
The
had
church
a prayer meeting
Had
for
a
her.
major prayer meeting for her.
wow.
Had the old films here and the new films here. You could put the old films up and see the deformity, put the new films up, totally gone.
So there's a new book out by Lee Strobel called The Case for Miracles, and it's really good. I haven't read the book yet, but I've been listening to his lectures on it, and he goes around and talks to doctors and stuff like that, and there's a ton of things happening
Tell you
where.
one more real
Okay,
quick.
all right.
This happened to me. back in 1988, I was working on the railroad. I was working on the railroad. Anyway, I was the foreman on the switch engine working in Elko, and as a foreman, you basically ran the job. I had a field man and then what was called a pin puller. And we needed to go out to this place called Pardo, which was a ballast plant to pick up a bunch of cars to bring in, because they needed to take those cars over to Salt Lake and help remember when Salt Lake flooded? No, it wasn't in 88, it was 84. Remember when it flooded? Anyway, so I get my dates messed up sometimes. But anyway, we take the switch engine out to Pardo. My job, I drop off, unlock the lock, line the switch. They take the engine back in to pick up the cars. They pull the cars out, so the engine goes out, and as the last car clears the switch, I line the switch back. We're on radios. So I line the switch, they said shove ahead, and I go to lock the lock, and I can't get it locked. It's just messing with me. And 3 cars had gone by. Well, I'm supposed to get on the point, the end car, to watch, because we're pushing against the current of traffic. I finally get it locked, I jump on, and by this time we're rolling about 10 miles an hour, and the max speed is restricted speed of 20, but still, even that's pretty fast on a train. So I jump on, and I go across the catwalk in between the cars, and I need to get up on top so I can see. So I'm crossing in between, and I look up, and on the end, there's a ladder that goes all the way top. So I'm in between the cars. Number 1 rule, they teach you in training, never climb an inside ladder on a car, ever. Well,
When it's moved.
moving or not, never climb one. It's like, why did they build them that way? But anyway, I'm climbing this inside ladder. Here's the two cars. I'm in between them.
Yeah.
I'm climbing the ladder. And on an open top hopper car, the last rung is inset. There's a lip that sticks out about this far, this big metal piece that goes around the top of the car, and the last rung is kind of up underneath it. And if you've ever been climbing a ladder really fast, there's a time when you have no handhold, because you're grabbing and letting go. So well, I let go, and I went to reach with this hand, and my fingers hit that lip, and I missed the rung. I had no handhold. I'm in between the cars. I start falling, and I look over my shoulder, and I can see the knuckles which couple the cars together coming up. And I just closed my eyes, and I said, Lord, not now. That's all I said. Verbally spoke it. The next thing I know, I find myself on my back, 15 feet approximately, away from the train in the ballast.
Oh,
Wow.
my.
It's like, nope, not yet.
Yeah. Crazy.
Wow.